I never thought I'd have to pretend to be poor to find out what kind of people my son had chosen to be his new family. But life, it seems, has a sense of humor. My name is Helen, and for most of my 61 years, I've believed in good manners, honesty, and the kind of kindness that doesn't ask for something in return. My husband passed away 7 years ago, and I've been living on my own ever since in a small but lovely house just outside Dallas. My son, Michael, has always been my pride. He's smart, hard-working, and the kind of man who still opens doors for ladies. I raised him with love, but maybe I also made him a bit too trusting. When Michael told me he was getting married, I was thrilled. I'd been praying for years that he'd find someone who would care for him the way I did for his father. He showed me pictures of her. Emily, a beautiful young woman with bright blue eyes and a smile that could melt an iceberg. I thought she looked sweet, genuine. But a mother's heart sometimes misses the shadows when the sun shines too bright. I was invited to meet Emily's family for the first time at a dinner they were hosting. I wanted to make a good impression, but Michael looked nervous when I mentioned wearing my good jewelry and a new dress. He said, "Mom, maybe just keep it simple. Emily's family is a bit traditional. They're very appearance conscious." Appearance conscious, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Do they care about what people wear more than who they are? He sighed and scratched the back of his neck. Just trust me, Mom. Maybe tone it down a bit. That night, I stayed up thinking about what he meant. Then it struck me, if her family was the kind to judge by appearances, maybe I should give them something to judge. So I picked my oldest floral dress, tied my hair in a loose bun, and left my pearl earrings in their box. I wore my scuffed shoes and carried the same handbag I'd had since Michael was in college. I even drove my old sedan instead of borrowing my neighbor's shiny SUV. When I arrived at their house, a massive modern home with white pillars and glass everywhere, I could already feel their eyes on me before I even rang the doorbell. Emily's mother opened the door, tall, perfectly styled, and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Helen," she said, looking me up and down. "Oh, you came all by yourself?" "Yes," I smiled warmly. "I like driving. Gives me time to think." She nodded tightly and led me inside. The living room was like something out of a design magazine. White furniture, gold accents, and an enormous chandelier that could probably pay for a year of groceries. Emily's father sat on the sofa, flipping through something on his tablet, and only looked up long enough to give me a polite nod. Dinner was an experience. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Emily's mother, Sylvia, would redirect it to something more interesting, like her charity gala or her Pilates group. I didn't mind at first, but it became clear that she saw me as background noise. "So, Helen," Sylvia finally said halfway through the meal, "what do you do these days?" "Oh, I'm retired," I said cheerfully. "I used to run a small catering business." "Catering," she repeated, almost choking on her wine. "How charming." "Yes," I smiled. "I loved it. Hard work, but rewarding. I still bake pies for my neighbors." Emily's father chuckled. "My wife doesn't cook," he said proudly. "We have a private chef. You should try his truffle risotto." I nodded politely. "I'm sure it's delicious." though I've always thought food tastes best when there's love stirred into it. There was an awkward silence after that. I noticed Emily's expression. Embarrassed, a little uneasy. Michael looked helpless. Sylvia was clearly deciding if I was adorable or just pathetic. The night continued with small jabs disguised as jokes. "Oh, Helen," Sylvia said at one point, "your dress is so vintage." "It's older than Emily," I said sweetly. "Still holding up well, though." Michael nearly spit out his drink, trying not to laugh. When dessert came, I offered to help clear the table, but Sylvia stopped me with a smile that could cut glass. "Oh no, dear. We have staff for that." I thanked her and sat back down, quietly observing. That's when I overheard her whisper to Emily in the kitchen, "I told you we should have met at a restaurant. This isn't the impression I wanted for our friends." My heart sank a little. So that's what this was about. Impressions. Appearances. Not love or family or sincerity. When the evening ended, I hugged Michael and Emily, told them I had a lovely time, and left. On the drive home, I couldn't help but smile to myself. Because what they didn't know was that I wasn't just pretending to be poor. I was testing them. My late husband and I had built something together. That little catering business had grown into a company we sold for a fortune before he died. I lived modestly because I wanted peace, not because I had to. But money has a funny way of showing people's true faces. Over the next few weeks, Emily's parents didn't invite me anywhere. Sylvia didn't return my calls, and Emily started visiting less often. I could see Michael's frustration, but he didn't want to admit what was happening. I stayed quiet, patient. Then one day, Emily called. "Mom, Helen," she said hesitantly, "my parents are throwing a small engagement party for us. They said they'd love for you to come." I smiled to myself. "Oh, how nice. Should I bring something?" "Just yourself," she said. But I could hear the nervousness in her voice. The night of the party, I decided it was time for a little truth. I put on the navy blue gown my husband bought me years ago for our anniversary. Simple, elegant, but undeniably expensive. I wore my pearls, my wedding ring, and tied my hair neatly. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not a poor old lady, but a woman who had lived, loved, and learned when to stand tall. When I arrived at the event, the valet took my car with a surprised look. It was new, sleek, and very unlike what they remembered. I walked into the hall and felt dozens of eyes on me. Sylvia nearly dropped her glass when she saw me. "Helen, you look different," she said, voice tight. "Do I?" I smiled innocently. "Just thought I'd dress up a little. This is such a lovely venue." Emily's father came over, visibly unsure how to react. "That's quite a dress," he said. "Oh, thank you. It's one of my favorites. I wore it when we signed the deal to sell our company." Sylvia blinked. "Your company?" "Yes," I said, taking a sip of champagne. "My husband and I owned a catering chain across the state. We sold it a few years ago. It did quite well. I've just been enjoying a quieter life since." There was silence. Delicious, heavy silence. Sylvia blinked at me as though she'd just discovered that the help could speak Latin. Emily looked frozen between pride and panic, her mouth open in a half-smile that didn't quite know which way to go. Michael stood behind her, trying his best not to laugh. I could feel his shoulders shaking slightly. "Well," Sylvia finally said, her voice high and brittle, "isn't that impressive? I had no idea." "Oh, it's nothing worth mentioning," I said casually. "I've always believed money should stay quiet while good manners do the talking." Her cheeks twitched. "Of course," she said tightly. The rest of the evening took on an entirely different flavor. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Emily's father asked me about investments. One of the uncles wanted to know if I'd ever considered buying into restaurants. And Sylvia, poor Sylvia, kept trying to compliment my classic fashion sense as though she'd been a fan all along. It was almost too easy to enjoy. I didn't say much about my wealth, just enough to let them fill in the blanks. Every time Sylvia stumbled over her words, I'd smile sweetly and offer her another canopy. When I left that night, Michael drove me home. He didn't say a word until we parked in front of my house. Then he turned to me and said, "Mom, did you plan this?" I looked at him with mock surprise. "Plan what, darling?" He laughed, rubbing his face. "You pretending to be poor, then showing up like that. You wanted them to see who you really are, didn't you?" I smiled softly. "Not exactly. I wanted them to see who they really are." He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned over and hugged me tightly. "You're something else, Mom." I patted his hand. "And don't you forget it." Days passed, and word of that night must have spread through their circle like wildfire. Sylvia suddenly started calling me, inviting me to lunch, to fundraisers, even to join her women's league. I politely declined each time, claiming I was busy or out of town. Nothing frustrates a snob more than polite indifference. But Emily was different. One day she came to visit me alone. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse. I poured her tea and waited for her to speak. "Mom Helen," she began softly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how my parents treated you that night." I looked at her and smiled kindly. "Oh, honey, you don't need to apologize for their manners." "No," she insisted, tears forming. "I should have said something. I was embarrassed. I thought they were just being them. But I saw your face that night, and I realized how wrong I was. You didn't deserve that." Her honesty touched me. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Emily, everyone shows who they are when they think they're not being watched. Your parents showed me theirs. But you're here. That says enough." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I want to be better than that. For Michael. For us." And I believed her. I really did. There was something genuine in her that her parents couldn't polish away. Months went by, and I kept my distance from her family, though they tried hard to draw me in. It seemed my little revelation had shaken their perfect world just enough to make them realize appearances don't always tell the truth. Then came the wedding. It was a grand affair at a vineyard outside Austin. White roses, chandeliers, and enough lace to cover Texas twice. I didn't care for the extravagance, but it wasn't my day, it was theirs. I arrived early, and to my surprise, Sylvia greeted me at the entrance herself. Helen, she said, smiling too widely. You look stunning, as always. We're so glad you're here. I smiled back. Thank you, Sylvia. I'm glad to be part of this happy day. She leaned closer. I hope there are no hard feelings about our first dinner. I was just, well, I suppose I misjudged a few things. Oh, don't worry about it, I said lightly. It was a lovely evening. I met your furniture up close. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or apologize, so she did both awkwardly. I left her standing there while I went to find Michael. The ceremony was beautiful. When Michael saw Emily walking down the aisle, the pride on his face melted my heart. He'd found love, despite the pretenses around it. And maybe, just maybe, Emily's parents would learn something from the day too. At the reception, people were laughing, dancing, and drinking champagne. Sylvia made a grand toast about two families becoming one. I raised my glass politely. But then, fate decided to have a little fun. Halfway through dinner, one of Sylvia's friends, a woman with a loud laugh and an even louder voice, said, "So Helen, tell us again about your catering company. I heard you sold it for millions." The room quieted just enough for everyone to hear my answer. I smiled graciously. Yes, it was a wonderful business. My husband and I started it from our kitchen. We worked hard, grew slowly, and made sure every employee was treated like family. We sold it to a national chain a few years back. It was enough to retire comfortably. Sylvia's face froze in a strained smile. Her friend turned to her and said with a giggle, "Sylvia, you never told me your in-law was such a successful entrepreneur." Sylvia opened her mouth, closed it, then took a big sip of wine. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After dinner, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The stars were bright, and the vineyard stretched into a peaceful horizon. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. It was Sylvia. She stood there awkwardly for a moment before saying, "You must think I'm a terrible person." I shrugged gently. "I think you're a person who values the wrong things. But that can change." She looked down. "I judged you because I thought wealth and class came from appearance. But you have both without even trying. It's humbling." I smiled kindly. "Class isn't about money, Sylvia. It's about grace. And you still have time to find yours." For a second, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She nodded, whispered, "Thank you," and walked away. Later that night, Michael and Emily came to hug me before leaving for their honeymoon. "Mom," Michael whispered, "I don't know what you said to her, but she looked different." I smiled. Maybe she just needed a mirror held up to her soul. When I got home that night, I kicked off my shoes and made myself some tea. I sat by the window, thinking about how funny life is. Sometimes people have to see the poor version of you to understand your worth. I thought it was the end of the story. But a few months later, something unexpected happened. Sylvia called me, not for a party, not for gossip, but because she needed help. Her husband had made a few bad investments, and the perfect glass house they'd built around themselves was starting to crack. "Helen," she said softly, "I know we're not close, but I'm lost. I don't know who to turn to." I hesitated for a moment, then said, "Come over. I'll make tea." When she arrived, she looked like a shadow of the woman I first met, humble, tired, and human. I listened to her talk about their troubles. For the first time, she spoke like someone real, not someone performing. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind her of how she once looked down on me. I just listened. And when she finished, I said, "You'll be fine, Sylvia. You're stronger than you think. Maybe this is life's way of teaching you what truly matters." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're too kind to me after everything." I smiled softly. "Kindness isn't a performance either, Sylvia. It's a choice." After that day, Sylvia and I began to speak more often, not out of formality, but out of genuine need. It started with little things. She'd call to ask for advice about downsizing or how to plan affordable dinners without losing elegance. Sometimes she'd ask for simple recipes. Sometimes, she just needed someone to listen. I didn't say much, but I could feel her heart softening, one call at a time. Emily and Michael came back from their honeymoon glowing with happiness. They moved into a modest home of their own, nothing flashy, just cozy and bright. Every Sunday, they invited me over for brunch. We'd sit together, laugh, and watch old movies. I liked seeing them so content. It reminded me that even in a world full of pretenses, love could still find a way to grow honestly. One Sunday, as we were finishing pancakes, Emily said, "Mom, Helen, my parents want to invite you for dinner again. Just a small family thing." I chuckled softly. "Oh, are they trying to test another disguise of mine?" Emily laughed. "No, I think they've learned their lesson. My mom keeps saying she wants to do things differently now." So I agreed to go. This time, dinner was quiet, simple, and pleasant. Sylvia cooked herself, nothing fancy, just roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a homemade pie that might have been slightly overbaked, but full of heart. When she set the food down, she said, "I didn't hire anyone this time. I wanted to cook for family." I smiled, genuinely touched. "Well, that's the sweetest gesture you could make." Her husband looked uncomfortable at first, but as the evening went on, even he started relaxing. He told stories from his younger days, and there were moments of laughter that didn't sound rehearsed. It felt real. After dinner, while Emily and Michael were washing dishes, Sylvia and I sat by the fire. She looked at me quietly for a long moment, then said, "You must think it's funny, how life turned out." "Not funny," I said softly. "Just poetic." She smiled faintly. "You taught me something that night, Helen. I thought power came from money. But you showed me it comes from dignity." I nodded. "The difference is one you can lose, the other you can't." We sat in silence, the fire crackling between us. I didn't need her apology. Seeing her change was enough. Months passed peacefully. Emily became pregnant, and I was overjoyed. When she told me, I cried and laughed at the same time. "You're going to make me a grandma," I said, hugging her tightly. "Your mom and I will compete over who spoils the baby more." Sylvia laughed when she heard that. "Oh, I think you'll win that one." The months of her pregnancy brought all of us closer together. Even Sylvia started visiting me regularly, helping me tend to my garden. She confessed once, while pruning my rose bushes, "You know, I used to think people like you were beneath me. But now I think I was beneath myself." I placed a hand on her arm gently. "We all start somewhere, Sylvia. It's where we end up that matters." Then one day, something happened that none of us expected. Michael's company was downsizing, and he lost his job. He came to my house that evening, trying to act calm but clearly worried. "Mom," he said, "I'll find something else soon, but Emily's due date is close, and we'll have to cut back for a while." I smiled and handed him a cup of tea. "Michael, when your father and I started our business, we were broke. Sometimes, losing something isn't an end, it's a redirect." He smiled faintly. "You always know what to say." A week later, I got a call from Sylvia again. "Helen," she said, "I heard about Michael. I know what it feels like to have things fall apart. I want to help. Would you mind if I asked my husband to offer him a position at his firm?" I paused for a moment. "That's very kind of you, Sylvia." She hesitated. "It's not kindness, Helen. It's gratitude. You helped me see the kind of person I want to be." Michael accepted the offer, and things slowly settled again. Emily gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and when they placed her in my arms, I felt something shift deep inside me. That tiny little bundle wasn't just the next chapter of our family. She was proof that love, decency, and humility could rebuild what pride once destroyed. Sylvia came to the hospital with tears in her eyes, holding a small handmade blanket. "I made this," she said shyly. "It's not perfect, but—" I laughed softly. "That makes it perfect." We took a photo that day. Me, Sylvia, Emily, and the baby. When I looked at it later, I couldn't help but smile. None of us looked rich or poor. None of us looked superior or inferior. We just looked human. Time moved on, and life calmed into a gentle rhythm. I watched Sylvia transform completely. She sold her enormous house, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even began helping young single mothers find work. When I teased her about her new, humble hobbies, she smiled and said, "You were my wake-up call, Helen. You gave me a second chance to be someone my daughter can respect." One afternoon, we were sitting together on my porch, sipping lemonade, watching the baby crawl in the yard. Sylvia said quietly, "You know, I still think about that first dinner. About how I treated you." I looked at her with a smile. "And I still think about that night too. But not with anger anymore. Just gratitude. Because it led us here." She nodded, her eyes soft. "You could have humiliated me that night. But you didn't. You chose grace." I chuckled. "Grace lasts longer than revenge." She looked thoughtful. "But you did get a little revenge, didn't you?" I grinned. "Oh, just a teaspoonful. Enough to make it interesting." We both laughed until our sides hurt. As the sun began to set, I thought about how strange life is. We spend so much time worrying about how people see us, when all that really matters is how we make them feel. Pretending to be poor had shown me more about wealth than money ever could. Because true wealth isn't measured in what you own. It's in the moments when you choose compassion over pride. Years later, when I became known in town as the wise old lady who outsmarted the snobs, I'd always laugh and say, "No, dear. I didn't outsmart anyone. I just waited long enough for the masks to fall off." A few years passed, and life rolled forward like a gentle tide. Emily and Michael's little girl, Grace, grew fast. Too fast, if you asked me. One moment she was learning to say, "Grandma Helen," and the next she was chasing butterflies in the yard, her laughter echoing through the garden like music. Every time I saw her, I thought about how far we'd all come. There was a time when I thought revenge meant getting even. But now, sitting on my porch swing, watching my son's family grow, I understood that real revenge isn't about payback, it's about peace. Seeing people change for the better, that's the sweetest kind of victory. One afternoon, as I was baking an apple pie, the phone rang. It was Sylvia. Her voice still had that polished lilt, but there was warmth in it now, a warmth that once had been missing. "Helen," she said, "I was wondering if you could stop by later. I need your help with something important." "Of course," I said, wiping flour from my hands. "Do I need to bring my rolling pin or just my wisdom?" She laughed. A real laugh. Maybe both. When I arrived at her new place, I barely recognized it. Gone were the marble floors and gold-framed mirrors. She'd moved into a smaller, cozy house with potted plants and mismatched furniture that somehow looked just right. There were photos of Emily, Michael, and Grace on the shelves. It didn't look like wealth. It looked like home. "I wanted to show you something," she said, leading me into a room filled with boxes and papers. "I've been working on something new. After volunteering at the shelter, I decided to start a small foundation to help single mothers find jobs. I don't have much money, but I want to use what I have wisely." I looked at her, touched beyond words. "Sylvia, that's beautiful." She smiled softly. "I learned from the best." I helped her sort through the paperwork that day, and we drank tea while planning the details. She asked me to be on the board, me, the woman she once dismissed as a poor, naive mother. Life has a way of bringing things full circle, doesn't it? As we worked, she said quietly, "You know, Helen, I used to think you were playing a game that first night. But now I see. You were teaching one." I chuckled. Maybe. But I was also learning. About patience, humility, and letting people grow on their own. When I left that evening, she hugged me. It wasn't the polite kind of hug you give at parties. It was warm, grateful, and real. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on me when you had every reason to." I drove home that night with tears in my eyes. Not sad tears, just the kind that come when your heart finally feels full. Months later, Sylvia's foundation began to flourish. I attended the opening ceremony, sitting quietly in the back while she stood at the podium, speaking to a small crowd. She talked about her past mistakes, about judging others, about finding meaning through humility. And then she said my name. I want to thank a woman who taught me that kindness can be stronger than pride. Helen, wherever you are sitting, this foundation wouldn't exist without you. The audience turned to clap, and I felt my cheeks warm. I wasn't one for attention, but that moment, it meant something. It meant that the person I once considered shallow had found her depth. Later that night, as I walked outside, Michael joined me. "You know, Mom," he said, "you always told me patience pays off. I never thought it would pay off like this." I smiled, linking my arm with his. "The best victories don't make noise, son. They just leave peace behind." Grace ran up to us, holding a dandelion, her tiny fingers clutching the stem. "Make a wish, Grandma," she said excitedly. I knelt down, blew on the dandelion, and watched the little seeds float into the warm night air. "I already got my wish, sweetheart," I whispered. The next few years passed in comfort and contentment. I helped at the foundation sometimes, baked pies for the volunteers, and told stories to Grace that made her giggle until she couldn't breathe. Every once in a while, someone in town would mention that story, how I'd pretended to be poor to test my daughter-in-law's family. They said it like it was a grand scheme, some kind of clever trick. But to me, it wasn't a trick at all. It was a reflection of how life works. Sometimes, you have to take a step back, strip away the shine, and see who still stands beside you when they think you have nothing to offer. One evening, Sylvia visited me with a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph of her foundation's first graduating class. 10 women, all smiling, all holding certificates. "I wanted you to have this," she said. "Every time I see these women succeed, I remember the woman who reminded me what success really means." I looked at her, tears glistening in my eyes. "You're the one who did the work, Sylvia. I just gave you a little nudge." She smiled. "You gave me more than that, Helen. You gave me a chance to be decent again." That night, after she left, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought about all the chapters that had led me here. The heartbreak, the disappointment, the quiet revenge, the forgiveness, it all added up to something far more beautiful than any victory could bring. As the stars blinked above, I thought of my husband. "You'd laugh at how it turned out, old man," I whispered into the night. "You always said kindness is the sharpest sword." And maybe he was right. Maybe all the power I ever needed was in that one simple truth, that dignity doesn't shout, and kindness doesn't beg. It just shines, quietly, until even the blindest hearts start to see it. The next morning, Grace came running into my kitchen, her little feet pattering on the floor. "Grandma, can you tell me a story?" I smiled, kneeling to her height. "Of course, my darling. What kind of story?" She thought for a moment, eyes bright. "A story where the good person wins." I chuckled softly and kissed her forehead. "Well then, you've come to the right storyteller." Because that was my story. A story where the good person didn't just win. She healed, forgave, and taught others how to be better. And in the quiet corners of life, that's the truest victory of all. The years slipped by as quietly as a sigh. My hair turned from silver to soft white, and the old house filled with the smell of coffee, cinnamon, and the faint echo of laughter that never really left. Life became slower, gentler. The kind of slow that lets you notice the way morning light moves across a table, or how the wind hums when it passes through the porch vines. Michael took over the family workshop. Emily began helping run Sylvia's foundation. Grace grew into a young woman who still stopped by every Sunday to bring me flowers, usually wild ones she picked herself. She was bright, curious, full of that spark that only belongs to people who've grown up surrounded by stories and forgiveness. One Sunday afternoon she sat beside me, the two of us wrapped in a faded quilt on the porch. The air smelled of rain and lilacs. "Grandma," she said, "Mom told me once that you pretended to be poor to teach people a lesson. Is that true?" I laughed softly. "Oh, child, that's one way of saying it. I didn't pretend to be poor. I just stopped pretending to be rich." She tilted her head, trying to make sense of it. "But why?" "Because, sweetheart," I said, "sometimes you have to let people show who they are without the distractions. Money, titles, fancy houses, they make noise. But when all that fades, you can hear hearts speak." And I wanted to know who was listening. She nodded slowly, the way young people do when they understand just enough to tuck it away for later. "You're kind of like the main character in those stories you tell," she said. "Except you're real." I chuckled. "Real enough to burn the pie every third Sunday." We both laughed, and then she leaned her head on my shoulder. For a long time, we just watched the sky turn gold. A few days later I found myself standing in Sylvia's foundation hall again. Older now, moving slower, but still able to bake the best apple pie in town. They were hosting their 10th year anniversary. The room was full of women who'd built new lives. Small business owners, nurses, teachers, mothers who'd once been scared to start over. Sylvia gave a short speech and insisted I say a few words. I wasn't much for speeches, but they handed me the microphone anyway. "I don't have a lot to say," I began. "Just a thought that's followed me all my life. People think revenge means hurting someone back. But sometimes the best revenge is simply living in a way that proves kindness wins after all. I've seen pride crumble and grace rebuild it brick by brick. If you leave this room with anything today, let it be that. Choose grace, even when no one deserves it. Especially then." There was silence for a moment, and then the room broke into soft applause. Some people were crying. Others just smiled through the tears. And in that sea of faces, I saw Sylvia wiping her eyes, mouthing the words "thank you." Later that night, I returned home, sat in my old chair, and looked around the quiet house. My husband's photo still sat on the mantel. I smiled at it. "We did good, didn't we?" A light breeze fluttered through the curtains as if the world itself agreed. When I finally went to bed, I thought about how everything had begun, with judgment, pride, a bit of pain, and how it had ended, with laughter, healing, and a family stitched together by forgiveness. I didn't just change their lives. They changed mine too. Some stories end with fireworks, others with apologies. Mine ended with peace. And that, my dear, is the sweetest ending there is.